Hey guys, Pastor Jim here. Excited to start our new series in the Gospel of Luke, investigating Jesus, how to find certainty in an uncertain world. And so excited to walk through this great book with you. This is what we typically do, is just walk through a book of the Bible. And so this will take us some time, but looking forward to doing that with you. Every series, every book that we study is a great opportunity to share that with a friend, invite a friend to watch with you, but especially this one, especially Luke, especially this great gospel that investigates Jesus, that looks into the claims of Jesus through eyewitness accounts. And so here's what I would do, is just encourage you to, even right now, just share the stream, share the link with some friends, neighbors, family members. Invite them to watch with you. Go ahead and do it right now. We're going to talk about anxiety. We're going to talk about the intolerance of uncertainty. We're going to talk about faith based on fact. And so it's going to be great as we look at this first part of the book of Luke. And so share that, invite some folks to join us, and we'll go ahead and we'll get started. At the end of last year, we did a big survey of our church, and one of the big things that stood out was that 86% of us, we feel anxious about life and don't have an inner peace from God. 86% said that was true. And that was before 2020. That was before the craziness and the uncertainty of this year. And I wonder what that number would be now. And basically what that says is that we are anxious. What seems to be an epidemic of our age, what seems to be the norm, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you go to church or not, is that we are living life chronically without any peace. We are anxious. It's the uncertainty of life, especially life in a hostile and divided culture, infused with, information, social media, all of that leads to this epidemic of anxiety. Some researchers in Canada, we won't hold that against them, they came up with something called the intolerance of uncertainty scale. The intolerance of uncertainty scale. And the scale assesses how much people desire and seek out predictability. And then how they react to uncertain situations. And basically the idea is that anxiety is like an allergy to uncertainty. You have a reaction, an overreaction to uncertainty that is unhealthy and destructive. So you get anxious, and that leads to panic attacks and social anxiety and specific phobias and depression and eating disorders and things like that. And then the scientists, their answer to this intolerance of uncertainty is to try to train people to increase their tolerance, to just be okay with uncertainty, to tolerate it. But the Bible and Luke, our author, they have has a better answer. It has better news. Our author Luke in verse 4 says he's writing this book that we may have certainty concerning the things that we've been taught. There's a true story that he wants to tell, and he thinks it's so foundational, so formative, that it will give us certainty in an uncertain world. Now, the Gospel according to Luke, it's one of 4 gospel accounts in the New Testament. There are 4 books of the Bible that cover the narrative events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, or what is called the Gospel. The Gospel just means good news. The word gospel is a translation of the Greek word euangelion, which is a combination of 2 words, you or good, and angelion or announcement. It's the good announcement. It's the good announcement according to Luke. And there's 4 of them. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels, which just means that they describe Jesus' life from a similar perspective. And then the Gospel of John is just it's an outlier. It's arranged a little bit differently. Think of it this way. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're kind of like Netflix and Hulu. And the Gospel of John is like YouTube, right? Same idea, just looks different, right? Just looks different. And so we're going to be looking at Luke's gospel. And Luke was a physician by trade. He's a doctor. He traveled with the Apostle Paul. And the Gospel of Luke is really just volume 1 of a 2-part book, along with the book of Acts. And Luke wrote much of the New Testament. The book of Luke and the book of Acts are huge books. And so Luke's contribution to the New Testament is huge. We know that Luke wasn't Jewish. It's possible that he's the same guy as Lucius of Cyrene, who was a leader in the church in Antioch, which would mean he was from North Africa, but we don't exactly know where he's from. And he's writing primarily to educated, upper class Greek audience. In verse 3, he says he's writing to the most excellent Theophilus, who's probably a magistrate or somebody in authority or somebody who at least was a part of the wealthy class, who perhaps is underwriting Luke and Paul's travels, or maybe just funding the writing of these two books, the Gospel of Luke and Acts. And so what's unique to the Gospel of Luke is that he's not writing to Jews. He's writing to Gentiles, and he's writing as an educated man to educated people. He talks about women more than any other of the Gospel writers. We're going to meet Mary and Elizabeth and Anna and Martha and Joanna and Susanna and many more. He talks about the poor more than any of the other Gospel writers. And the underlying theme to Luke is love. Matthew's theme is Jesus' kingship. Mark's theme is Jesus' power. But Luke's theme, he emphasizes the humanity of Jesus and the compassion and love that Jesus has towards people. Now, that doesn't mean that the Gospel of Luke is flowery or sentimental, not at all. He tells us right at the beginning why he's writing, and that is so that you would have certainty, that you would be certain of what you have been taught. And he gives 3 reasons why we can be certain, why we can trust his account of Jesus, because that's everything, right? If Jesus is who he said he is, and if Jesus did all the things that Luke says that he did, that literally changes everything. Everything changes if that's true, if we can be certain of those things. And so he gives us 3 reasons. He says in verse 1, hey, I've compiled a narrative. In verse 2, he says, hey, I've talked to eyewitnesses. And in verse 3, he says, and I've written an orderly account. 3 things: narrative, eyewitnesses, and an orderly account. So first, this is a narrative. It's a story. These are real things that Luke is talking about that have happened to real people in real time, in real space. Christianity isn't some kind of idea on a whiteboard. This isn't a philosophy that we're talking about in a lecture hall. Christianity isn't based on some textbook or just some idea. He says in verse 1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Actual things have been accomplished. This is real life stuff that has happened. It's not conjecture, it's not hypothesis, it's not ideas, but historic fact, a real narrative, true life. Christianity is about the good news of something that's already happened, something that's already been accomplished. Anxiety, on the other hand, uncertainty, they come because we don't know what tomorrow holds. We're not sure. We've got our ideas, but we can try to predict it. We can try to control our circumstances, but we don't know. But Christianity is based on real life narrative, something that has already been accomplished and something that has already happened. It doesn't get more certain than that. I've said this for years because I think it's true and I think it's compelling. But Christianity is completely different than any other philosophy or religion or way of life. Every other religion, every other philosophy is the same. It tells the same story. It has humanity at the center of the universe. Humanity's at the center, and we have to work to get to heaven. Whatever your heaven might be, whether that's nirvana or enlightenment or the American dream, but we have to work to get to heaven, which means we have to be moral, or we have to have good karma, or we have to be successful or religious or whatever. But we're working to get to our heaven. And it's just this idea. Nobody's ever done it. It doesn't work. But Christianity tells a completely different story. Christianity's narrative is that God is at the center of the universe, and we don't work to get to God. God works to get to us. That Jesus enters human history, lives the life that we should have lived, dies the death that we deserve to die, and then rises from the dead, giving us new life in him. That's a completely different narrative. And it's already happened, and Luke is going to prove it. That's what Luke is setting out to do. And then if you're like, yeah, Pastor, like that's where you lose me. It's great that this is a story, but that's an outrageous story, and I just can't believe it. Right? If that's where you're at still, I get it. Like, I understand that. In fact, if you're skeptical to Christianity, we're so glad that you're watching. We've always sought to be a church, a place, a people that it's safe to be skeptical about these things, to ask these questions, to wrestle still with who Jesus is and the Christian faith. And so I get it, right? I mean, we're talking about a virgin who gives birth to a man who also happens to be God, who lives a perfect life, and so they kill him. And then he rises from the dead, he floats into heaven, and then he's going to come back soon on a white horse with a sword coming out of his mouth. You might have some questions about that. And yet, what you believe relies on faith as well. Christians don't have the market cornered on faith. If you believe that nothing created everything through something that doesn't exist called time and chance, and spread everything to everywhere, and somehow through that time and chance took a special liking to a relatively small rock in the course of things, in the expanse of everything called the earth, and then sloshed around in the oceans in the mud for a little while until eventually rational, reasonable beings with a consciousness were formed who could create the internet and play baseball, praise be to God, and send people to the moon and then die and go back to being nothing. Well, that takes some faith too to believe that. That's a story that needs a little bit of faith as well. What is more reasonable? That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, or that in the beginning was nothing and nothing created everything, so that eventually some things could reason that nothing had created them. That's going to take a leap of faith as well. The point is this: Luke is saying, I've got a viable narrative to tell you. About actual things that have actually been accomplished. I'm going to tell you this story so that you can be certain. And my aim is that you would have certainty about this in the midst of all the uncertainty around you. Okay, so the first thing Luke says is, I've got a story to tell. It's a true story. Second thing that he says is that he has eyewitnesses. Verse 1 again, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Verse 2, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. And so Luke says, hey, I've got a story to tell you so that you can be certain about this Jesus guy. I've talked with the eyewitnesses. This is legit. All right, this is Dr. Luke saying, man, this is no fairy tale. This isn't myth. This isn't fable. This is a true story. This is legit. I've got eyewitnesses. And Christianity has always been about eyewitness accounts. It's always been about flesh and blood and actual events. Jesus, I'll give you a couple of examples. Jesus, he heals a blind man, and the religious leaders go to investigate, and they're skeptical of Jesus. And the man who Jesus heals says, listen, I don't know who he is. I mean, maybe he's the Messiah, maybe he's not. All I know is this: at one point I was blind, and now I see. Eyewitness account. In Acts 4, Peter and John are being threatened, being told, don't talk about this Jesus guy anymore, and by the religious officials, by the way. And what they say is this: we have to speak about what we have seen and heard. We're eyewitnesses. We've got to talk about this. And then last example, the Apostle Paul is talking about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, which was probably the earliest letter written in the New Testament. And he says this: he says, he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. And so Paul's like, hey, Jesus appeared to more than 500 people. Most of them are still alive. Go talk to them if you want to, because Christianity is based on eyewitness accounts. This is why Luke is writing. This is why we have the Bible, because of eyewitness accounts. Further, what you have seen and heard, what I have seen and heard, what you have experienced with Jesus is a vital part of the church's mission as well. That the eyewitness accounts don't start with just those that saw the risen Lord, the risen Jesus. Don't just start with, it's not just about those in the Bible times, but also now, because Christianity has always been about eyewitness accounts. It can't stop with us. The gospel, the good news that we talked about earlier, it's dynamic. It's not static. It doesn't terminate on us, but when we receive it, it rolls off of us, and it's meant to roll to those around us as well, so that it can have its great effect on them too. Just like Peter and John said, hey, we have to speak about what we've seen and heard. We also have to speak about what we have seen and heard. I know Christians like to talk. We've been talking a lot this year, right? We've been talking about politics and viruses, and we've been talking about cultural issues and all of that. But when is the last time that you told somebody, once I was blind and now I see? When's the last time that you said, hey, here's what Jesus did in my life. Here's been my experience with him. Let me give you my eyewitness account. When's the last time that we did that? We're baptizing people today in person at Doxology. And that's what they're going to say. They're going to, their story is going to be their eyewitness account, right? Christianity is built on those stories where we can't stop telling about what we have seen and heard. Think about it. In the midst of the uncertainty and the chaos of this year, what if every one of us went out this week and gave our eyewitness account of Jesus and what he's done in our life to one friend, to one neighbor, to one coworker, whoever, right? To one somebody. What if we were to continue this eyewitness account of Christianity? What might God do? What might God do in the dynamic message of the gospel for God to meet with people through our eyewitness accounts? And so Luke says, hey, I've got a story, I've got eyewitness accounts, and then lastly, he says, I want you to be certain, so I wrote it in an orderly way. In verse 3, he says, it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So he's saying, hey, I followed this closely. I interviewed eyewitnesses. I wrote down an orderly account of these events. So like a skilled litigator, Luke, he's organizing his case to present it to us that we might be convinced, that we might be persuaded. That phrase, having followed all things closely, it means literally carefully investigated. In fact, some of your translations will say that. He's investigating Jesus. I'm investigating this Jesus and his works and his claims, and I'm going to present this case to you for your careful consideration. That's what Luke is saying. It's interesting how, at least in my experience, how little people have actually thought about Christianity and Jesus who don't believe, right? They don't believe, and yet they haven't really thought much about why they don't believe. They haven't investigated. In fact, some of you watching now, you don't believe. And if you were honest, you haven't really thought all that deeply about why. Maybe you have some preconceived notions or some thoughts about it, but you haven't investigated. You haven't really probed deeply into what is monumentally important to either believe or not believe, right? Either to know or not know. And so I would urge you to do that. We are in a day of conspiracy theories and fake news and carefully curated content where our algorithms are anticipating our predictable behaviors. And we're so habitual and automated right now, it's crazy. And you're on autopilot right now, flying right into the storm of more anxiety and more uncertainty, and you're not thinking deeply about it at all. I would urge you to think deeply about these things. I want to encourage you, Christian or not, to consider deeply these things that Luke is putting forward for us. The most popular podcast in the world right now is Joe Rogan. He interviews people for up to 5 hours at a time, and people listen because it's carefully nuanced, thoughtful conversation and debate. People are hungry. Our culture is hungry for real, thoughtful consideration. We're tired of soundbite news. We're tired of that. We need that. And most people who don't believe what Christianity teaches, they don't think it's reasonable, but they haven't actually reasoned that. They haven't done enough reasoning about why they don't think it's reasonable. And so kind of the conversations I have are like this. You'll hear this a lot. Like, I can't believe in Christianity because of science. And typically that comes from math and science people, from engineers and doctors and people that are kind of wired that way. And we'll go down that road and we'll have that conversation. But then there's a whole other group of people that won't believe. They're artists, they're more socially conscious people. Maybe they're students who are believing everything that the professors are telling them, and they don't believe in Christianity. They don't believe in Jesus because of completely other reasons. Christianity is culturally regressive, they might say. It's archaic. It's keeping women barefoot in the kitchen. It's unreasonable to think these things about gender and sexuality. And aren't you guys the ones that voted for Trump? And so then it's just something completely different for why they don't believe in Christianity. And nobody's actually investigating. What does the Bible actually say? What did Jesus actually say? What about his truth claims? What about what Christians do believe? What about these eyewitness accounts? What about what Christianity really is? Nobody's actually doing that. They're not investigating. And I think in part because Christians themselves haven't thought deeply about these matters. We have to correct this idea that somehow faith and reason, or faith and thinking, or faith and facts are somehow opposed to each other. They're not. Christianity was and always has been a thinking man's faith. The Bible is concerned with how we think. Faith is about trust in reality and facts, not just blind allegiance to something. And people inside the church and outside the church still think that faith is just blind faith, and it isn't. It just isn't. The Bible commands that we would consider and think deeply about these things. The book of Isaiah, it starts with God inviting us to reason together. Literally, it says, come, let's reason together. The greatest commandment is that we are to love the Lord our God with our whole heart, soul, and mind. We're to love our God with our mind. We are to take thoughts captive, 2 Corinthians 10. We are to have the mind of Christ, 1 Corinthians 2. We are to be renewed in our minds, Romans 12. We are to think maturely, Philippians 3. We are to pray even and sing even with our mind, 1 Corinthians 14. These are biblical commands and concerns over how we think. Faith is meant to be thoughtful. God wrote us a book. He didn't, give us a finger painting. We're to read and think and consider these things. And so we should. We should investigate with Luke this Jesus and what he has said and done. And then think about one more thing with me. Anxiety, it's a response to the uncertainty of your world. But then Luke writes in verse 4 again, he says, hey, I'm writing that you may have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught. These first 4 verses, they're actually one sentence in the original language, and that long sentence ends with this word that's translated certainty, meaning this is his emphasis. He's saying, hey, I'm carefully investigating this narrative. I'm interviewing the eyewitnesses. I'm writing this down in an orderly way so that you may be certain in this uncertain world. We have an intolerance to uncertainty, and it's led to an epidemic of anxiety. And Luke says, what if you could be certain about the deepest questions of the universe? What if you could be certain about the most meaningful things? What might that do to change you if you could be certain? Tim Keller, he has this quote that says, anxiety is a daily statement to God saying, I don't think you have my best interest in mind. What if you could be certain about that God? What if you could be certain that there is a God and that he does have your best interests in mind, that he does love you, that you could be reconciled to him, that you could have a meaningful relationship with the God of the universe? What might that change in your life? There was a popular article years ago that was written on the epidemic of anxiety in America. And the authors said this. They said the possibility that forces outside our control might be overwhelming us, changing us even, is so frightening that most of us busily hunt down safe responses to our escalating anxiety. We rely in record numbers on prescription drugs. We escape into the media entertainment pleasureplex. We pile on the amusements only to find, as Leonard Cohen sings, that you're locked into your suffering and your pleasures are the seal. Basically, what they're saying is what we already know. Our search for a cure for our anxiety hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. And what's interesting is what they suggest is the beginning of the cure. What we should start to do for our anxiety actually has biblical principles, completely secular articles written by secular authors. They said this. They said, we want our problems to be solved without ever having to trouble ourselves with investigating their root causes. The way forward begins with voluntarily taking a step back and then looking around for clues. They're basically saying we need to think deeply about our life. We need to think deeply about the deeper matters of life. That we need to carefully investigate and consider thoughtfully what the heck is going on and why we're so uncertain and why we're so anxious. Here's my point, and here's what I want us to do. As we turn the page on 2020 soon, thanks be to God. I don't know what it is about an arbitrary, 6 weeks from now, like turning the page, like New Year's isn't going to change what's happening with COVID and all that stuff, but there's something about it, hopefully mentally, that maybe just feels like a new start. As we turn the page on 2020, as we embark on this long study of Luke's gospel, as we look at Jesus through the Gospel of Luke, and as we find ourselves, hopefully, I would think, discontent with where we are personally, discontent with where we are culturally, discontent with where we are as a church. Aren't you ready for a change? Like true change, some sort of personal change, personal revival, corporate revival, cultural revival? I am. But here's my hope. As we consider these things, what if you did what they say to do? What if you voluntarily step back out of the uncertainty, out of the chaos? What if we do what Luke says? What if we carefully consider the certainty of Jesus? What if we stop looking at ourselves so much and we stop looking at the world so much and looking for a brief numbness to the anxiety from the world? What if instead we looked at Jesus more? What if we went on a trek, a journey with Luke, right? With Dr. Luke, and we just investigated Jesus at a deeper level? What if we invited some people to join us in that? What if we did that? It might mean you have to shut down your social media for a while. It might mean that you have to radically reduce your TV watching. It might mean that you jump into the Paradox 365 Bible reading plan. It might mean that you practice regular silence and solitude in order to get out of some of the chaos. It might mean that you start a journal. But what if you voluntarily step back and look for clues around you to what's causing your anxiety, to why you're so discontent, to carefully consider the deep things of the world? What if we did that? What if we allowed God to transform our inner world of anxieties and fears and insecurities? What if we invited God to do that? I think we need to withdraw from the toxic, anxious environments around us, to confront our own anxiety, to live our lives a little bit more in the face of God and not so much in the face of the world, to cultivate some certainty in the midst of the chaos. We're not going to be certain about all things, but maybe we can be certain about some of the deeper things, and then watch how God might use us as we enter back into the craziness of this world. What if we can see more of God and then be eyewitnesses to his truth, beauty, and goodness? Jesus lived, Jesus died, and Jesus rose again. And if that's true, it changes everything. If the reality of the world is that you're at the center and everything depends on you and you've got to work your way to heaven, then I would submit to you that that's not good news at all. I would say that's actually the core reason for your anxiety. But if Christianity is true, if there is a beautiful and holy God at the center of the universe, and in his love for you, he came after you and he made a way for you by faith that you would know him as he knows and loves you, well, that's good news. And I think that's the answer to all our anxiety. Let's pray. Father, we come to you even now, together as a people, as a church, as guests that are watching. And even now, we confess to you some of our anxiety. We confess to you some of our uncertainty. In fact, those of you watching right now, I want you to just take a moment, get away from the world, get away from even just living life before the mirror, before yourself, and right now actually respond to God and just confess your anxiety to him? What is that? Like, name it. Name the anxiety. Name the uncertainty. Name the worry. And just tell God, here's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about my job. I'm worried about my kids. God, I'm anxious about this virus. I'm anxious about 2021. I'm anxious about my finance. Whatever it is, just tell him. Confess that. Confess that. Lay that before him. 1 Peter 5, it says to cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you, that God cares for you. And then here's what I want you to do as well. I want you to commit to God, to stepping back from the chaos. Maybe you even need to ask him, like, God, what is one thing that maybe I could step back from that would help me just get out of the confusion and chaos and help me to cultivate more contentment and certainty in you. Maybe it's TV, maybe it's social media, maybe it's some other activity, I don't know. But ask God, what is that? Or maybe you already know, there's a conviction about that. And commit that to him. Say, God, I'm committing this to you. That I'm going to step back from this. I'm going to step out of this. I'm going to spend more time investigating you, pursuing you, going after more of you. And so, God, we offer these things up to you. We thank you that you've come after us. We now come after more of you. In Jesus' name, amen. Love you guys. See you next week.